So we're going to go on to dairy food. So people say, okay, well, maybe I don't eat fish and I don't eat chicken and I don't eat pork and I don't eat red meat. But by the way, I've got to have yogurt. I've got to have kefir, which are all milk products. And milk is not a human food. Milk is to take a little calf and create a large 1,000-pound creature. And when we consume milk, our body cells get cross-circuited and they start to react in unique ways. So let's look at milk versus kale. Kale, by the way, has more calcium than milk and more protein than milk. Kale also has a lot of nutrients and doesn't have the saturated fat, or as our colleague, Dr. Campbell, will tell you, giving you the #1 dietary cause of all forms of cancer. The brilliant understanding that he gave all of us more than 30 years ago has been proven out here on the campus of Hippocrates Health Institute for the last 7 decades, because we have taken milk out of the diet. We've taken all animal foods out of the diet. And when we look at what happens with people who come here, in most cases who have consumed those and have created disorders and disease and premature aging, unanimously and universally, we see reversals if a person remains committed to eating a diet and having a mindset that is affirmative. Now, I want you to look at this picture. This is almost perversion, if you think about it. But obviously, we all seem to be a little perverted, because it's easy for us to walk into the store and to buy milk. It's in a carton, and they always have pictures of happy cows on the commercials. And you're thinking, gee, these cows are just really happy that we're pulling their bosoms and taking milk out that's for their baby. They perpetually keep the cow pregnant, which is not a natural state, by the way. And from what I've been told, the poor nipples of the cow are so sore and so inflamed that they constantly are shot with antibiotics. Now, this young, attractive woman under sucking from the nipple, if you saw this when you were driving along on a highway, there would be no doubt in my mind you'd call the police and she would be arrested. But how many times have you consumed milk from the nipple of a cow in the confines of your home, the confines of a restaurant, and nobody arrested you? Nobody thought it was perverted. So let's just get right to these things. Look these things in the eye, think about it. This is relative to reality. I know a lot of you today aren't really sure what's real and what's not. Today we're talking about real. We're talking about factual data that is scientifically based. So acne. In countries, by the way, where there's little to no acne, there is little to no dairy food consumption. Isn't that interesting? What we also know is a higher amount of fat, my old favorite dairies, whipped cream, ice cream, cheeses. By the way, there you have higher amounts of acne. When we remove dairy foods from people's diets, we see a rapid and radical shift in skin outbreaks of acne and other infections, by the way. It's not only acne, but acne is the most notable of all. We look at allergies and asthma. The only time I ever died, and this is not an embellishment, I was 2.5 years old. I died. They put the sheet over me. Happened to be, I had one uncle that was a physician. He was at that hospital that day. A nurse went up and said, go down and console your relatives. Your nephew just died. He came down, pumped my heart, brought me back to life. And throughout my entire youth, I had eczema all over my body, all over my face. When I started to like gals, I was so embarrassed. And little did I know then, as I know now, that lung problems are why people get eczema. So, of course, asthma and eczema are brother and sister. And when I became a vegan, within a matter of 2.5 months, it cleared up. That was over a half a century ago. My lungs today, more than a half a century later, are better and healthier than they were as a child at 20 years old. Now, I saw it firsthand. Allergies. There were some remarkable studies done a very large one done in Lithuania. I looked at, I think, 3,500 children and looked at the biggest culprits in giving allergies to them. And it was eggs and dairy food. They removed it, and there was an 81% decrease in the symptomology. Singapore did a similar study on 7,000. Exactly the same results happened. Over 80% of people, or the children, by the way, the symptoms went away. How about heart problems? Well, people say, well, you know, I take dairy sometimes, but I don't eat red meat. Fact of the matter is, it's just as bad as red meat. It may even afford you more saturated fat than red meat, because I know as much as I consumed meat at one point in my life, I consumed a lot more dairy. You didn't have that many varieties of meat, but you had so many ways that you could get dairy in, and so many ingredients required, or so many recipes, I should say, required dairy food. And so we got so much of that into our bodies, and it is directly linked with heart attacks and strokes. So the Mayo Clinic actually showed us that, and they showed us that there's a certain chemical that comes into the body and actually creates that. It's a protein blocking chemical, and it reduces something called nitric oxide in the body. And when you start to mess with nitric oxide and you actually have a coagulated protein that blocks the arteries, you're actually on your way, as I say, a fast train towards having death and dying occur. How about bone problems? This is the most ironic of the entire discussion when it comes to dairy food. I was literally convinced as a child, as all of you were, no matter where you are on the planet Earth, that if we didn't consume dairy, our bones would fracture. Study after study show that's inversely the opposite of true. Harvard went out and looked at it and saw no connection to high calcium or high dairy consumption to less fractures. The same amount of fractures people had, by the way, when they didn't consume dairy food at high amounts. And in fact, the studies went further to say, the more you consumed, the higher possibility that you would have a fracture. Now that's ironic, isn't it? We have day after day, new data information coming into us on this very subject. Now just think of what I've said so far. This is going to create everything from skin disorders to asthma, to allergies, to bone fractures. And we haven't stopped yet. How about breast cancer? So many years ago, we started to recognize here at the Institute, as well as all over the research community globally on breast cancer and other forms of cancer, there's something called IGF-1. It's an inflammatory marker that is the highest in dairy food, milk, and all of the things we make from milk. And if you really want to have breast cancer, that's one of the best ways to have it. If you saw studies that were done on this, they actually find the DNA of the very dairy that the person consistently consumes. Now, there's other factors too, emotional factors, bacteria in the mouth, but when you compound all of these and you add one on top of the other on top of the other, the likelihood that a woman is going to end up with breast cancer, or even a man, by the way, because men do get breast cancer, is dramatically increased. So when you look at these studies, and all of these are available, and I only reflect what is representative of dozens, if not hundreds of other studies when I'm making these presentations for you. How about colon cancer? Again, TMOA, something that we actually found a number of years ago, actually is directly linked to this. And when you look at what happens, it gets into the body, mutates the cell, and actually affects the colon more than anything else. And there were studies even published by the United Nations, since governments around the world who were in bed with the dairy industry and all of the other meat-related industries, by the way, were unwilling to tell the public what was coming out from the scientific community. And colon cancer was right there at the top of the list from consuming. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you have the IGF-1 problem on that one. You also have the MMTO problem on that one. It's a different form of chemistry in the body that literally mutates the cell, specifically in the lymphatic system in this case, leading to this type of lymphoma. The lymphoma is a lymphatic system cancer. And by the way, all cancers have a lymphatic connection, but this one specifically, the epicenter is right there. How about depression? This is one that nobody ever puts on their radar, but there is data on this one that is, you could write books on it. Let me put it that way. There were studies done in Australia, the United States, Europe, that actually show you the higher amount of fatty dairy you consume, the higher amount of depression people have. Now, we're not saying this is all because of the brain. Remember, dairy must do something awfully bad in the gastrointestinal tract to wipe out the effectiveness of the healthy bacteria. And it actually brings in unwanted bacteria and starts to precipitate neuron dysfunction that the serotonin receptor sites are shut off. And remember, the serotonin is what allow you not to be depressed. If you have adequate amount of serotonin pump coming out from the gastrointestinal flora, 90% of it comes out from there. And this is really amazing when you start to look at it. They went further to say that the highest amount, people actually are prone to even more schizophrenia. Now, these are not studies done flippantly, where they just looked at one group. They're looking at hundreds of people over long periods of time. They're taking people who have problems and taking control groups and comparing them, and the people who are consuming dairy and the people who are not consuming dairy. It's pretty easy to do. In most populations, you have people eating Asian diets that consume little to no dairy food. And in the Anglo diet, it's widely consumed. So it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to have control groups that do not consume dairy and look at the mental health of people and the depression levels of people who are consuming dairy versus who are not consuming dairy. This is an obvious one, gastrointestinal problems. By the way, where do you think most colic comes from with children? You're feeding them another animal's milk and formula, which is unbelievable. It's mostly sugar. And so the gastrointestinal tract starts to ferment. You go way back in studies on this one 100 years ago, and they told us then what would happen. And it's even more knowledge we have today. So directly from dairy food, we have all kinds of gastro problems. And these problems accumulate not only to something acute like colon cancer, which we just mentioned, but you may have more diverticulosis, diverticulitis, Crohn's disease, colitis, the list goes on, irritable bowel syndrome. We see it right here. When we remove the dairy food and start to give them healthy, living, plant-based roughage, we start to see almost instantaneous changes in the symptomology. And then the data that we're getting in examination and testing starts to prove out within a matter of days and weeks. Obesity is an obvious one, but there's some little hidden secrets here that you may not know. So at one point, if you would ask me, if a person's not going to listen to what you have to say, and they're going to consume dairy anyway, and let's just relate it to fat, being overweight, being obese, which would be the one that would be least likely to make them fat? I would have incorrectly said to you, low-fat milk and skim milk. Well, boy, that was blown out of the water by DeBow at the University of Virginia. They actually looked at this and saw in long-term studies that when you actually took the low-fat and the skim milk, you had a 57% increase in being overweight. Isn't that stunning? Why? Because obviously the saturated fats do cause a problem, but they're not the only culprit in this picture. There's other fat-producing chemistry within the non-human food we call cow's milk. And don't think I'm only saying cow's milk. It's not healthy to take sheep or goat's milk either.